Please welcome the panelists.
Tom, thank you for the introduction. And yes, Tom summarized the problem and the question simply, which is documentary films are all of a sudden making news. This wasn't what they intended to do. Usually they were deep looks into a problem that hadn't been explored enough. And now all of a sudden with a film like Invisible War or a film like what Laura Poitras is making now, documentaries are actually making news. And all of these kinds of things are things that you would have been 60-minute stories in the past, or would have been long New Yorker articles, or would have been New York Times investigative pieces, and they're documentary films. So why don't we start with Tom? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what documentary film used to be and how we got to this place.
You mean in a network context?
Yes.
I think there's, if you look at network news and documentary films, there are really two trends. One is the trend in which CBS Reports is a good example of, in which networks put documentaries on in prime time as a way to keep their license. That was really their motivation. I think networks have never really wanted to make documentaries as a business. It's not something that they view as profitable. But originally, back in the 50s and 60s, and this was in the late 70s, they were still doing it because it was a way to keep their license and gain some security with the FCC. And then during the 80s and 90s, I think that sort of stopped for a while. I worked at CBS Reports for a while, and then I started working on Nightline myself, and then worked in news magazines, and then went back and started making documentaries as an executive producer at ABC News with Peter Jennings. And that's the other sort of trend, is that documentaries appeared on network news because of the power of an individual anchor, generally, to compel them to do it. I think those are the only two reasons that networks ever put on documentaries, to help their license issues, or because a journalist who worked inside the network was able to force them to do it. And one thing that I think is really sad now is that the networks are out of that business completely. I mean, if you really look, and it's really only in the last 3 or 4 years. We can talk about what the consequences of that are, but if you're looking for cause, there's just nothing to compel the networks to do documentaries anymore.
But also that means that important stories are left not to large news organizations to cover, but to individuals, which means not the same administrative support, not the same legal support, and different motivations. Andrew, you had a point when we were talking about this before, about the different bar for someone to take on a documentary film versus taking on writing a news story, and what that means in terms of getting news out there.
Yeah, I think it comes from both directions. You know, you have certain films that are really expensive to make, and then the question is it fair to the universe and consumers and people that want to understand what's going on in the world, that the bar is raised now so that a documentary filmmaker has to be motivated and committed to spend a lot of time and a lot of money, and what sometimes turns out to be a few years or more of their lives, making a movie about something, whether it's an injustice or it's just a fascinating story. So certain little improprieties in the world that could be exposed by a television news story, now you've got to get them. Somebody just said recently in a publication, I can't remember where, they said, if you're a wrongfully convicted person, the best thing you can do is to get a filmmaker to decide to make a film about you. From the other from the bottom up, you have experiences like we had with this movie Catfish, and in a weird way with Capturing the Friedmans, where the filmmaking started because there was a family who was in a position to document themselves. And so there was a level of miniaturization. You know, if you think about when you started, the size of the camera, the size of the studio, the size of the egos, the size of getting somebody, with the stature of Peter Jennings or whatever to be interested in the subject, or so the Friedmans just started documenting themselves because David Friedman happened to be able to afford a video camera, which now looks like, like the old cell phones or something. It's a giant, crazy thing, but from our standpoint, it's like this beautiful and nostalgic way of looking at it. We had a similar experience with Catfish, where the guys who had gone on that journey, Neve, who had this experience with this woman, where he had been surprised to learn the true identity of a woman that he had fallen in love with, had been documenting on a little, Canon little mini HD camera forever, So there you have the opportunity for something to be generated as a story just because everything is being filmed now.
It strikes me that there's something different also in the storytelling of a successful documentary film than of a great piece of journalism. And Philip, maybe you might actually disagree because you sort of do what I'm going to describe in journalism. But for example, in a great documentary film, generally it's going to be character driven, it's going to be dramatic, it's going to be emotionally compelling, it's going to have an arc like a feature film. And it's one thing to get your news in that form as opposed to the form of an analytical piece that isn't dramatically constructed. And I wonder if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Can I, before you answer, Philip, can I just defend the form here? I think if you do the journalistic stuff, which I did for many years, and you're not thinking about drama, you're failing miserably. So it's just a different way of rendering drama, if I can disagree with you a bit there, Dan. But anyway, okay.
Yeah, I just don't see that as that inherently different. I mean, look, when there's an NSA story, there was this big debate, let's say, about the NSA story when it first came out, and when Snowden first identified himself, decided to out himself. And the question was, he said, I want to do this so that the story isn't all about me. And everybody was like, well, that's a hell of a way to do it. You just made yourself the story. And he was saying no, because otherwise it was all going to be a big story about who done it. And I want it to be clear why I did it, rather than a lot of speculation. I want to get it back onto the material and so forth. Well, of course, he became the story on some huge level. That captured people's interest. And meanwhile, people got to work doing the long, analytic, complicated, rather technical analysis of this stuff and putting it out in different ways and figuring out what the legal climate was and figuring out how to partner or not partner with various kinds of news organizations, for better and for worse. And I think I can't see a single downside in any of these developments. The best argument for feeling sad about what you're saying about the networks is a certain kind of personal or historical connection to what they were at their best.
There's another interesting point here, which is Joe. How many of you know about Joe Berlinger's film about oil? Joe Berlinger is a great filmmaker who did a film about a travesty in the oil industry, and all of his material was subpoenaed in a lawsuit. And he claimed First Amendment rights, and ultimately they were denied. And to me, what's interesting about this is Joe Berlinger was just a guy out on his own doing this, and he had to fight, I don't remember what the oil company was, Exxon or something. But what if it had been Joe Berlinger working, it was the 1970s, it was Joe Berlinger working for ABC News, and Exxon had gone after ABC News, would there have been a different outcome? And these are the kinds of things that I worry about with individual filmmakers have to deal with world-shaking stories, but they don't have any support.
Well, that's no question about it. I mean, and I agree with the point that you're making, that those are incredibly valuable gatekeeper role, and also it's both gatekeeper and backup. I mean, it's sort of the legal stature and institutional backup that comes with that. Or some channel will develop that does that. They'll just be like, look, we will, in a sense, be the umbrella that starts to bring you in, and we'll have legal cover, and we will issue you a press card at a certain stage in your project, and you will be, we'll be under that. We're going to get a couple of great pro bono lawyers until we can pay them well, and we're going to create this thing. It could be done.
I think there's an answer as to why that's complicated, but I'm interested in Tom's, and then I'll give mine.
Well, I mean, if the question is, will the networks take other people's work and pay a small amount of money in order to put it on their air? Yes, absolutely. They'll do that.
Sign me up. That sounds great.
But it's a small amount of money, trust me, I promise. But I think that doesn't stimulate original reporting. I think that's
I'm
a
not
very
sure though.
different
I'm not
idea.
sure this thing is small amount of money. I'm not. I mean, I don't make.
I am.
I don't personally. I don't make.
I'm in that business.
Well, I understand, but
promise
I don't
you.
make. I don't make movies to make money, and if I did, I would be a terrible, terrible failure at doing so. But I do believe that. You have. I mean, I had a business that I sold to AOL, and I remember AOL at the height of their, success, where they had 30 million subscribers paying them $20, $30 a month, $200 billion market cap. They were always internally saying, like, what is up with this Snapchat? Let's just bring them in. Bring those guys in. We'll just make them part of us. And the truth is that the entrepreneurial filmmakers are very much like the entrepreneurial internet startup guys. They say, I'm not sure I want to be part of the Borg.
So the way that you're seeing it also, there's a larger pattern, which is if you look at the new news organization that PRO BDR is going to form, right? Does everyone know about this organization? So PRO BDR is a billionaire who's partnering with Glenn Greenwald, who with Laura Poitras broke the Snowden story, and they're starting, as opposed to Jeff Bezos, right, who went and bought the Washington Post, they're spending the similar amount of money to go and start a new news organization. And there was a very interesting debate between Bill Keller of the New York Times and Glenn Greenwald, in which Keller said you have to be objective, which in Keller terms means you say these people said X, but the other people said Y, even though if Y is preposterous. You have to do both things. And what Greenwald is saying is no, you're honest about your preconceptions and your assumptions and your values, and then you go and you report the story in your point of view, and that's going to be where journalism needs to go. And in that sense, documentary is just part of that.
They created Fox News.
I
They'll be
think
tussling
the
over
notion of
facts.
objectivity, if Bill Keller really said what you said he said, Dan, then he's not as smart as I thought he was. But the notion of objectivity is absurd on its face. I mean, we all have our own values, and they're imposed on everything we do, including whatever we put out for other people to consume. But there is this question of accountability, and that's really what matters, accountability for what's truthful. And I think what institutions bring, and if Greenwald's does that with their own, prejudices stated clearly, at least as they see them, other people might see them as different. Fox News is a good example. What are their prejudices? And they certainly don't articulate them clearly in ways that other people perceive them. But as long as there's accountability for doing things that are inaccurate, I mean, that's really the best you can hope for. But I certainly agree with the competitiveness. And I think what's great about this present time is that documentary films offer another dimension in which journalism is practiced either directly or indirectly, and that's incredibly valuable, incredibly valuable.
Andrew, I see you engaging in all kinds of facial expressions. I'm wondering what the thoughts behind them are.
Oh, man. I do think that there is something happening. And I agree with you that the invisible hand is sort of taking care of it, in a way that documentary filmmakers are starting to become somewhat more important. The crazy guys with cameras are putting things on YouTube, and that's also important. That network news anchors who insist on having 2 documentaries a year that they can do, that's largely gone away, I agree, but it's not entirely gone away. But all these things are important. But it seems to me there is something.
Do you wish that you had that superstructure behind you?
It's why my face was contorting. Because on the one hand, I love the freedom of it. The truth is I'm not beholden to a network saying we can't piss off this advertiser or we don't want to upset the status quo. So on that front, I'm probably more fair. I certainly put in more work than most news organizations do. And I vet things as carefully as possible. And I tell my lawyers, watch this like you and I didn't have coffee last night. You don't know who I am. You're just watching this to see whether it's fair. But I do think that the general public is hungry. Not everybody in the general public. Plenty of people are just willing to watch Fox News. But I think the general public likes to be able to hear that stories were vetted, that work was done, that these things didn't just come out of someone's imagination. And it's a little weird that my work is going to be judged exactly the same way as some guy who's throwing something up on YouTube that might be completely dishonest.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to my panelists for joining us.